The war is over. 1918. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, is finally dead. Its bones are being picked over by the victors. But in the dust of its collapse, a ghost story is being told. A story of 1.5 million ghosts, Armenian men, women, and children marched out of their homes by Ottoman gendarmes into the Syrian desert and never seen again. For the men who held the whips, the men who gave the orders, the war's end is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a reckoning. A series of trials will be held in Istanbul. A hunt for justice will cross continents. But what happens when the state fails to punish its own killers? What happens when murderers are set free? This is the story of that failure and the brutal personal justice that followed. We will look at 4 distinct fates that awaited the gendarme commanders and officials accused in the Armenian death marches. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is built on decades of painstaking research, drawing directly from the original court-martial records in the Ottoman archives, as detailed by historian Taner Aksam in his 1996 book, The Turkish National Identity and the Armenian Question, and cross-referenced with British Foreign Office files from the period, specifically file FO 371/6504R, which documents the failure to prosecute the Malta internees. Now back to the information. Our first story begins not in the desert, but in a courtroom in occupied Istanbul. The year is 1919. The man in the dock is Kemal Bey. He was the wartime governor, the Mutasarrif of the Yozgat district in central Anatolia, a region known for its fertile plains and a large, prosperous Armenian population that had lived there for centuries. Kemal was not some uneducated brute from the provinces. He was an educated man, a trained pharmacist from the Balkans, who had served in several administrative posts before being assigned to Yozgat. He represented the modern Aksayo, bureaucratic face of the killing machine. His trial would become the most prominent of the entire post-war period, a test case for whether the new Ottoman state could truly hold its own accountable. The charges against him were specific and damning. The indictment, read before a military tribunal presided over by the formidable Lieutenant General Nemrut Mustafa Pasha, accused Kemal of orchestrating the massacre and destruction of the Armenians of Yozgat. One by one, survivors took the stand. They spoke of how, in the summer of 1915, Kemal personally oversaw the implementation of the deportation orders. They described how he created a special committee of local party officials to manage the process, and how he armed local Turkish and Circassian irregulars, known as sets, promising them plunder in exchange for their service as killers. A key witness, a priest named Hovhannes, testified that Kemal gave a speech to local Muslim notables, telling them that the Armenians were enemies of the state and that their removal was a national necessity. The court heard testimony about the fate of the men from the town of Boğazlayan. They were separated from their families, their arms bound tightly with ropes. They were marched by gendarme units under Kemal's authority to nearby ravines, places like Keller, Kashla, and Uzundere. There, the seats fell upon them with axes, daggers, and rifles. The gendarmes simply stood and watched. The entire male population was annihilated in a matter of days. Women who survived the initial marches later testified that Kemal Bey personally extorted money and valuables from them, promising protection he never delivered. Throughout the 2-month trial, Kemal's defense was consistent. He was a patriot. He was a soldier. He was following orders. His lawyers argued that he was merely implementing the official temporary law of deportation passed by the central government in Istanbul. He claimed that any deaths were the unfortunate but unavoidable result of wartime conditions, disease, starvation, or the actions of rogue criminal bands he could not control. He was, in his own words, a small cog in a vast state machine, a loyal official doing his duty in a time of national crisis. He blamed everything on his subordinate, the local gendarme commander, Major Tevfik Bey, claiming Tevfik was the one who exceeded his authority. But the evidence was overwhelming. The court-martial, under intense scrutiny from the occupying British and French forces, was not convinced. Nemrut Mustafa Pasha, a man with a reputation for severity, saw Kemal not as a cog, but as a crucial engine of the local slaughter. He was found guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. On the morning of April 10th, 1919, Kemal Bey was transported to Beyazıt Square in the heart of Istanbul. A large wooden gallows had been erected, a stark message from the new government of Sultan Mehmed VI. A massive, divided crowd gathered to watch. For the city's remaining Armenians and liberal Turks, it was a moment of catharsis, a sign that justice was possible. For Turkish nationalists, it was a national humiliation. the sight of a Turkish official being executed at the behest of foreign powers. Before the noose was placed around his neck, Kemal read his final statement. "I am an innocent man," he declared. "My only crime was to serve my country. I am sacrificing my life for my nation, and I will die a Turkish martyr." Then, the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. As his body swung from the gallows, it was pelted with stones by some in the crowd, while others wept. A photograph of the scene was published in newspapers. For a brief, flickering moment, it looked like a new era of accountability had dawned. It was a false dawn. The nationalists would soon elevate Kemal to the status of a national hero. His family was granted a state pension. A monument was erected in his honor. His execution was not the start of a reckoning, but an anomaly. An exception that proved the rule. Cold, calculated, legal. But for most of the killers, this was not their fate. Our second story is of a man whose name was synonymous with a unique form of barbarity. His name was Kemal Azmi, the governor, or Vali, of the Trabzon province, a historic and cosmopolitan port city on the Black Sea coast. Trabzon was not the Anatolian heartland. It was a window to the world, with a vibrant Armenian community of merchants, artisans, and intellectuals. There was no vast Syrian desert here. No convenient wilderness into which he could march his victims to their deaths. So Kemal Azmi, a loyal member of the Committee of Union and Progress, improvised with chilling creativity. The Istanbul Court-Martial, which tried him in absentia, compiled a horrific record based on survivor testimony and, crucially, the reports of foreign diplomats stationed in Trabzon. The Italian consul, Giacomo Guerini, provided a detailed account. He described how Azmi would order the rounding up of Armenian women and children. They were told they were being relocated to the nearby port of Samsun. They were packed onto large barges and other sea vessels. The gendarme escorts would take the boats out into the Black Sea, far from the shore. Then, the plugs were pulled, the seacocks were opened, or the boats were simply capsized. Thousands were drowned, their bodies washing up on the coast for weeks. Consul Guerini personally confronted Azmi about the drowned women and children whose bodies the sea cast up on the shore. Azmi, he testified, was unmoved, coolly replying, "We must finish with the Armenians, so be it." The German consul, Dr. Bergfeld, sent similar reports back to his own embassy, confirming the drownings and other atrocities. For those not sent to sea, Azmi organized death marches into the treacherous Pontic Alps, into a ravine known as Gümüşhane, where they were systematically killed. He converted the local headquarters of his political party, a building that became known as the Red House, into a torture chamber for the Armenian elite of the city. He was known to have a particular hatred for Armenian children, ordering thousands to be taken to a remote building and burned alive. His cruelty was so exceptional that even some of his Turkish colleagues were horrified. But when the war ended, Kemal Azmi was nowhere to be found. On the night of October 2nd, 1918, just before the Ottoman surrender, he joined the top leadership of the Cup, men like Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Bahayedin Shakir, and boarded a German U-boat. They slipped out of the Bosphorus under the cover of darkness and fled to Odessa, and from there to Germany. The government in Berlin, the Ottomans, a wartime ally, granted them refuge. While the court in Istanbul gathered evidence of his crimes, Azmi was living freely in Berlin. On July 5th, 1919, the court-martial found him guilty of premeditated mass murder and sentenced him to death. The sentence was an empty gesture. Justice, it seemed, would never reach him, but the Armenians had not forgotten. In 1919, at its 9th World Congress in Yerevan, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation made a fateful decision. Frustrated by the world's indifference and the escape of the chief perpetrators, they secretly authorized Operation Nemesis, named after the Greek goddess of divine retribution. Their mission was to create a blacklist of the genocide's architects and hunt them down one by one. Kemal Azmi was high on that list. For 3 years, Nemesis operatives tracked him. On April 17th, 1922, 2 assassins, Arshavir Shirakian and Aram Yerganian, finally located him. They found Azmi walking down Uhlandstrasse, a busy street in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin. He was not alone. He was with another major architect of the genocide. The assassins approached, drew their pistols, and opened fire. Kemal Azmi, the butcher of Trabzon, died on a cold German pavement. Thousands of miles from the sea, he had turned into a graveyard. The state had failed to punish him. So the children of his victims delivered their own verdict. Justice denied, justice taken. The pattern repeats. The third man to fall that day in Berlin was even more significant than Kemal Azmi. He was Dr. Behaydin Shakir. He was not a regional governor reacting to orders. He was one of the central planners, a key ideologue, and the chief field organizer of the slaughter. Shakir was a medical doctor, a graduate of the Military Medical Academy in Istanbul. This medical background makes his life's work all the more chilling. He was a founder of the Committee of Union and Progress and a leader of its most shadowy branch, the Teşkilat-ı-Mahsusa, the Special Organization. This was not a regular army unit. It was a clandestine paramilitary force that answered only to the inner circle of the Cup. Its purpose was to carry out the state's dirtiest work, from espionage to mass murder. And its most important mission was the Armenian genocide. Shakir's role, as pieced together from decoded telegrams and trial testimony, was to be the bridge between the political decision in Istanbul and the physical extermination in the provinces. In the spring of 1915, Cankumav, he embarked on an inspection tour of the eastern Anatolian provinces. His official job was to organize public health. His real job was to organize mass death. He would arrive in a provincial capital like Erzurum or Van, meet with the local governor and gendarme commander, and convey the secret, unwritten orders of the Central Committee. The deportations were to be a cover for annihilation. To carry this out, Shakir activated the special organization's butcher battalions. These were mobile killing squads made up of loyal party militants and Gendarmes. Most notoriously, thousands of violent criminals, murderers, bandits, rapists, released from prison for this specific purpose. These convicts, or seats, were promised amnesty, a small salary, and, most importantly, whatever they could plunder from their victims. Shakir's system was diabolically clever. The official gendarme units would march the Armenian columns out of the towns and cities. Then, a short distance down the road, they would hand them over to, or simply step aside for, the special organization's killers. This provided the state with plausible deniability. The deaths could be blamed on rogue bandits or the hazards of war, but it was a centrally organized extermination, and Shakir was its field marshal. Like the others, he was tried in absentia in 1919 and sentenced to death. And like the others, he found a safe haven in Berlin. He was not just hiding. He and the other exiled QP leaders were plotting their return to power in Turkey. They saw themselves as a government in exile. But Operation Nemesis was closing in. The same operatives, Shirakian and Yerganian, who had Kemal Azmi in their sights, had also been tasked with eliminating Shakir. On that April day in 1922, as they walked together, the assassins struck. Behaydin Shakir died next to his co-conspirator on Ulandstrasse. His death was more than an act of revenge. It was a decapitation strike against the old guard of the Cup, an attempt to ensure that the men who had destroyed a nation would never again hold power. The German authorities were largely indifferent. While they had arrested Soghomon Tehlirian for the assassination of the chief architect, Talat Pasha, a year earlier, the ensuing trial had turned into an indictment of the victim. Tehlirian was famously acquitted. For Shakir, there was no arrest, no trial, just a bullet. If you value this kind of deeply sourced historical storytelling, subscribe to the channel. It lets us know you want more. Let us know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. The failure of formal justice is a central theme here. A story built from documents held for a century in national archives. Now, back to the story. Execution, assassination. For a handful of the guilty, these were their fates. But for the vast majority of the accused, their fate was far more mundane and far more infuriating. The fourth story is not of one man, but of 144 men and one island, Malta. In the months following the Ottoman surrender in 1918, to the Allied powers, led by the British, began a systematic effort to arrest suspected war criminals. The British High Commission in Istanbul, under Admiral Sir Somerset Calthorpe, compiled extensive lists of suspects based on intelligence reports, missionary accounts, and information supplied by the Armenian Patriarchate. They arrested former government ministers, provincial governors, army generals and local gendarme commanders. Anyone with credible evidence linking them to the organization of massacres was taken into custody. These men, over 140 in total, were then put on British ships and transported to the Mediterranean island of Malta, on a British crown colony. They were imprisoned in the Verdala and Salvatore barracks, to be held until a proper international war crimes tribunal could be convened. It was a landmark effort, a plan to hold individuals accountable for state-sponsored atrocities, a direct precursor to the Nuremberg trials a generation later. The list of internees was a who's who of the Ottoman wartime regime. It included men like Arslan Tauz, the gendarmerie commander who oversaw the final death camps at Deir ez-Zor in the Syrian desert, a place where hundreds of thousands of starved and brutalized survivors of the death marches were finally exterminated. It included governors, ministers, and military officers who had the blood of thousands on their hands. But the promise of a tribunal in Malta dissolved into a legal and political quagmire. The British government's top lawyers in London reviewed the case files and hit a wall. The evidence, while morally overwhelming, was legally problematic for a British court. Much of it was eyewitness testimony from survivors, powerful, but considered hearsay in the rigid British legal system of the time. To get a conviction, they needed official documents, signed orders, authenticated telegrams directly linking the men imprisoned on Malta to specific massacres. The new Ottoman government in Istanbul, while initially cooperative, was weak and unreliable, and more importantly, they refused to hand over the state documents that would incriminate their own former officials. Meanwhile, the political landscape in Turkey was shifting dramatically. A charismatic and ruthless general, Mustafa Kemal, was organizing a powerful nationalist movement in the interior of Anatolia. His goal was to expel the Allied occupiers and forge a new, independent Turkish state from the ashes of the empire. As his forces grew in strength, the idea of prosecuting old Ottoman officials became politically toxic. Then, in 1921, Kemal's nationalist army captured a group of British soldiers, including a high-ranking officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rawlinson. Kemal offered the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, a simple and cynical deal: your 20-odd hostages for my 144 heroes on Malta. The British government faced a stark choice. They could pursue the legally fraught, politically explosive, and increasingly hopeless cause of international justice. Or they could cut their losses, declare the effort a failure, and bring their soldiers home. They chose their soldiers. In 1921, in a series of exchanges, every single one of the Malta internees was released. They were put on a Turkish freighter, the Köln, and sent back to Istanbul. Not a single one ever faced trial for their alleged crimes. Many, like Arslan Toz, the gendarme of the death camps, were welcomed back as national heroes. They went on to hold prominent positions in Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's new Turkish Republic. Serving as members of parliament, diplomats, and military leaders, their fate was the most common, and perhaps the most brutal, of all, complete and total impunity. They got away with it. The Istanbul trials, which had begun with the execution of Kemal Bey, also collapsed under the weight of the nationalist resurgence. The courts were quietly disbanded in 1921. The case files, the indictments, the mountains of testimony, it was all packed away, locked in the Ottoman archives, and forgotten. For the next 70 years, the official history of the Turkish Republic denied that a genocide had ever occurred. The trials were written off as an act of victor's justice, a national humiliation forced upon a defeated people. The evidence was buried, seemingly forever, but paper has a longer memory than politics. In the 1980s, a new generation of scholars, including Turkish historians like Taner Akşam and Fikret Adanur, committed to confronting their country's past, began the difficult process of finding those lost files. They navigated the labyrinth of the archives. And they found it all. The original court-martial records, the indictments, the decoded telegrams from Talat Pasha ordering the killings. They cross-referenced them with provincial records, property confiscation lists, and population data. This academic work confirmed the authenticity of the evidence that had been presented in 1919, the same evidence published by the Armenian survivor Aram Andonian as early as 1920. The files that convicted Kemal Bey and sentenced Azmi and Shakir to death in absentia were real. The evidence that the British failed to use against the men on Malta was real. It had survived regimes, denials, and the passage of time. The killers died. The files did not.